Hello and welcome. What is the war on terror? That was the label given to everything from the fight against Al-Qaeda to the Iraq war after the attacks of 9/11. How will it change under the Obama administration? This war included ideological warfare or the battle for hearts and minds. It also included preemptive strikes, torture, and new levels of surveillance and intelligence gathering. It has sparked debates about a possible clash of civilizations, and it has challenged the legal systems of countries around the world, especially in the United States. So today we ask, what is the future of the so-called war on terror in the post-Bush era? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. We welcome your phone calls on the show as well. I'm joined today by one of America's top legal and international security experts who argues that much that American officials believe about terrorism is plainly wrong. He is Philip Bobbitt. He's been a presidential advisor to 6 U.S. administrations and now teaches law at Columbia University and the University of Texas at Austin, from where he joins us. His latest book is Terror and Consent: The Wars for the 21st Century, which talks about a new definition of warfare and how we measure victory in these new wars. Mr. Bobbitt, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for asking me.
Let's start first with this phrase, the war on terror. It was something that was coined in the previous Bush administration. You say much of what U.S. officials believe about this war is wrong. How so?
Well, the last administration did not raise taxes. They did not strengthen our alliances to fight such a war. They did not increase the size of the army. That is, they did not do the sorts of things that American administrations have customarily done in fighting a war. So perhaps the first step is to say that while we identify the phrase war on terror with the Bush administration, it really has much more to do with changes in the nature of terrorism and changes in the nature of warfare that the Bush administration sometimes was not altogether on top of.
Well, tell us about those changes. I suppose what you're saying is that we need a new interpretation of terrorism?
I think that's right. Just to begin with the definition of terrorism, we've been unable to agree on this, as you know, for quite some time. Some people think that it's the use of violence against civilians. Some people think that it's the use of violence by non-state actors. Actually, I don't think either one of these criteria is all that useful, because states can use terror, and killing an innocent policeman, whether he's a civilian or not, can still be an act of terror. In my book, I argue that terrorism should be defined as the use of violence to advance a political agenda to prevent people from doing what they have a lawful right to do.
When we talk about those incorrect approaches that was taken by the previous administration, let's talk for 1 second about the war in Iraq, the war to topple Saddam Hussein. Do you think that that was a necessary war for the United States?
I don't know if it was necessary. It's always hard to read the future, but it is also, I think, a little lax to think that Saddam Hussein would have just simply faded away, or that the sanctions, which were so onerous on the people of Iraq and showed little impact on changing the regime, would have been allowed to continue indefinitely. I think you have to say, if the Americans and the British and others had not removed Saddam Hussein, what would have happened to him? And my guess is he probably would be there today.
But that could go for any number of countries around the world that are run by dictators right now. Many of those countries are allies of the United States. So are you saying that the United States, in its own defense, should go around changing these regimes as it wishes?
Well, no, and I don't think we could, even if we wanted to. Saddam Hussein presented really quite an interesting and almost unique figure. There are states, as you say, that are equally despicable in how they treat their own citizens, and there are many of these states. And there are other states that are violent towards their neighbors. Saddam Hussein was the first party to invade a member state of the UN and annex it. But what made him really unique, I think, was the fact that not only was he ambitious and ruthless, cruel towards his own people, but he was also rich. And that meant that he posed the kind of threat that very few states pose.
But we can't dispel the fact that he also had an enormous quantity of oil.
Yes, I'm afraid that's the point. that gave him a power and a menace that other states simply don't have.
Okay, Mr. Bobbitt, I'm going to go to an email that we received from one of our viewers. This is from Riz Khan in Pakistan, and he writes, "Any war is wrong. The war on terror is more so because it's based on the U.S. ideology of being, quote, with us or against us. But there is no question of choosing not being with the United States. If this ideology is changed and more empathy is shown towards others, then the war on terror can be won, not otherwise." Do you agree?
I think I agree in part. I don't know that every war is wrong. Sometimes wars are necessary to prevent an even worse state of affairs from occurring. We have a picture of warfare that it's begun by aggressors. That's actually seldom the case. Usually it is the party who is attacked that actually makes the move to war. Aggressors don't want war. They want the fruits of war. So I'd say I partly agree.
When you say war is necessary, doesn't that, by implication, mean that diplomacy in the world has failed? The ability to talk one's way out of problems has failed?
Sometimes. Sometimes diplomacy can be an evil in itself. If you think of the diplomacy of the Second World War, it really bought time for the fascist. It wasn't simply that it failed to produce peace. It was a useful ally of the most violent, the most vicious forces in Europe, and I would say in Asia.
And when we talk about the war on terror now, who, in your view, is the enemy? Is the enemy Al-Qaeda? Is it the Taliban? Is it radical Islam? Is it any other force?
I think right now, the kind of terrorism against which you might actually fight a war would be a global, networked, outsourcing terrorism, of which Al-Qaeda is the only example. But there's nothing about Islam that makes it a necessary party to this. And my guess is that when the war against Al-Qaeda is over, and I think it will be over, we'll still face these threats. They won't come from Islam, but we will still face threats from global networks that can pose some very, very lethal threats to society.
You know, we've often heard this term that when the countries like the United States, other countries in Europe are fighting what is termed as an asymmetric war. And you point out in your book that future wars will not be between nations. So what will future wars look like?
Well, I hope future wars won't be between nations. You can never rule this out. And by far the worst wars, the wars that are almost too horrible to contemplate, would be wars between nations. Pakistan and India, North and South Korea. These would be terrible, terrible conflicts.
I'm going to go to
war
go ahead, sorry.
Yes, do. No, please.
I'm going to go ahead to another email which we received from Gim or Jim. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. This is from Aden in Yemen, and he writes, "The greatest acts of terrorism are not committed by furtive gangs of masked desperados in foreign lands. The most horrific acts of terrorism in the world have always been committed by governments and their militaries. Is the U.S. government the world's greatest terrorist organization?"
Well, I think that the caller, the emailer's assertion that the greatest acts of terror are committed by states is absolutely right. I think this is certainly the case, and it will probably continue to be the case for some time. However, I wouldn't rule out the fact that relatively small groups will in the future be able to use at least some of the weapons that states have had a monopoly on in the past. That will represent a major change. As to whether the United States is the greatest terrorist threat, I think that's absurd, and I hate to hear people say that, but I know many people believe it.
When one talks about the war on terror, is it a winnable war? And if it is winnable, at what stage does one declare victory?
I think you have to have a very clear-sighted idea of what victory is. If you think that victory is the defeat of the enemy, most people think that. You may think that. Most of my students think that. Then it's hard to see how you win a war against terror, but that's not really victory. That's victory in football, but that's not victory in warfare. Victory in warfare is a matter of achieving the war aim, and that's a very different matter. If the war aim is the protection of civilians, if that's the war aim at a war against terror, then yes, you can win a war like that. And you win it by continuing to protect civilians.
And in practical terms, you believe that is achievable?
I do. Indeed, I do. In fact, if you look at even such a very contested theater as Iraq, violence against civilians is down by 90%.
Mr. Bobbitt, we're going to have to take a break right now, a short break. More of our discussion with Philip Bobbitt in a moment. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Dum